Well, again, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for Jeffrey Sachs, who's here with us. Um, I'm not going to say much about Jeffrey. Uh, People are very familiar with him, other than the fact that 10 years ago, he wrote um, a book on this speech in JFK called To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. Very, very important book. And the other thing I would say is that one of the only people I know who's listened to this speech and read it more times than me. So take it away, Jeffrey.
Martin, thank you so much. Greetings to friends around the world. It's true, I could listen to it every day, and I just relished listening to it again just now together with you. Almost exactly 60 years to the moment, in fact, including obviously to the day that it was given on June 10, 1963. It is one of the greatest speeches of modern history, one of the most important speeches of modern history, and one of the most pertinent speeches for us today, for our very survival today. As Martin said, I wrote a book about the speech 10 years ago to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the speech, because I thought that its general principles were so important and the eloquence of the speech was so great that it needed a celebration. Today, 60 years from the day of the speech, we need to understand it precisely because we are right now again at the brink of nuclear war. And those who say that we are not don't understand the world that we live in, don't understand the dangers that we face, don't understand the path of escalation in Ukraine, which has been a path of bluff and then counter bluff and then escalation and counter escalation, not for the year plus since Russia's invasion on February 24th, 2022 took place, but for more than 30 years. I've seen at least some of it with my own eyes because I was an advisor to the economic team of President Mikhail Gorbachev. I was an advisor to President Boris Yeltsin. I was an advisor to President Leonid Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine. And I remember those days, and I've watched how, I'm sad to say, United States policies have wrecked the hopes of those days and put us on a path that now is causing shocking and shockingly dangerous devastation in Ukraine. So this speech is so much more relevant today than 10 years ago. And we need to understand what President Kennedy was telling us. Now, let me describe just a bit about the historical context of this speech. President Kennedy, in my view, was one of the great statesmen of the modern age. But the presidency is a very hard job, and President Kennedy came in fully committed to maintaining the peace, and yet, because of the nature of US politics and US governance, and because of the nature of the Cold War in those days, nearly stumbled into nuclear annihilation. Because that threat is hovering over the world in the modern time, and we don't eliminate it by closing our eyes or pretending it isn't. And as I've said, the Ukraine crisis has brought us dramatically close to disaster. So President Kennedy came into office, of course, on January 20th, 1961, and gave one of the marvelous inaugural addresses that we remember to this day. And one of the messages in the inaugural address was, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." So President Kennedy came in determined to find a way to peace at the height of the Cold War. But the tensions were enormous at that time. And two are worth bearing in mind to understand the historical context of the speech. One was the general context of the Cold War itself, which is that there never was a peace agreement after World War II. After Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, there was never a peace agreement or peace framework agreed. And what that meant was that the status of Germany was never determined. Germany in 1945 was occupied by the four victorious powers: the United States, Britain, France, and Russia, or I should say the Soviet Union, Those four powers divided Germany, and they divided Berlin, the capital of Germany under the Nazi regime. And there was no agreement about what to do with Germany. The United States decided soon after the end of the war that Germany should be remilitarized. This was shocking to the Soviet Union, which had lost more than 20 million citizens to Nazi war making. And the Soviet Union was aiming for can you hear me again?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah,
Yes.
sorry, I don't know why it dropped, but I'm back. The Soviet Union was aiming for demilitarization of Germany or neutrality of Germany, but the United States decided that Germany would be remilitarized and would be the bulwark of a new US-led military alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was never accepted by the Soviet Union, which pressed for some kind of resolution that would directly address Soviet security concerns. In 1955, just as a point of background, the Soviet Union, which was occupying part of Austria, agreed to withdraw its troops from the occupying zones of Austria in return for Austria's declaration of neutrality. And the Soviet leadership wanted to show to the United States and to the so-called Western world or the NATO countries that if Germany would be neutral rather than a NATO militarized country, the Soviet Union would withdraw not only from East Germany, but presumably from Central and Eastern Europe as well, because its security concerns would have been addressed. The United States would have nothing of it, however. Austria proved over the succeeding decades that neutrality was a marvelous solution for Austria, but the United States rejects the idea of neutrality in general. The United States wants NATO to be present in as many places as possible. So this was never settled with regard to Germany. At the end of the 1950s, the German leader, Chancellor Adenauer, started to seek nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower was not really against that. And so there was talk about expanded access to nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union leadership was horrified. This ratcheted up the sense of conflict. I could go on at length and should, if we had the time, to explain why, by the time President Kennedy came into office, we were at the height of the Cold War. Just to say that President Eisenhower and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev were scheduled to have a summit in the final year of President Eisenhower's presidency, but the CIA flew a spy plane over the Soviet Union. The spy plane, the so-called U-2 spy plane, was shot down. The CIA, as is so often the case, either lied to the president or made a misjudgment, but told Eisenhower there's no way that the pilot could have survived or that the plane could have survived. Eisenhower went out, and when the Soviet Union claimed that it was being spied on by a US plane, Eisenhower publicly declared that that was a lie. This was a weather plane that had gone off track from Turkey, at which point the Soviet Union brought out the pilot, Gary Powers, and the plane wreckage and said, "You lied directly to us about utterly sensitive matter." This was the context, and of course the summit was canceled. This was the context in which President Kennedy came into office. Soviet fears over a nuclear Germany, unsolved German issues, and rising tensions. In 1959-60, Fidel Castro also succeeded in toppling the US-backed dictatorship of Batista in Cuba and established a revolutionary government. The United States immediately began plans to overthrow Castro, and Castro appealed for security to the Soviet Union. When we say, our leaders say today, any country can choose any allies, this is not exactly how Eisenhower regarded Castro's approach to the Soviet Union. Eisenhower gave the order to the CIA to devise a plan to overthrow Castro. And that plan landed on President Kennedy's desk in early 1961. That, of course, was the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion. President Kennedy was extremely wary and skeptical of this plan. But as a new president, he was not in a position, he felt, to countermand a plan that was in the works, that had landed on his desk, and where the CIA was pressing extraordinarily hard for this. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by the United States was a massive debacle. All of the Cuban refugee troops that were part of the CIA-led invasion were quickly captured or killed on the beach of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. And Nikita Khrushchev wrote in a back channel to Kennedy, "President Kennedy, there is a illegal piratical act being carried out by your government." President Kennedy unwisely responded by saying, "This has nothing to do with us. This is not our affair." Nikita Khrushchev wrote back and said, "Don't lie again." The United States lied twice to the Soviet Union on matters of fundamental significance within a very short period of time. When you combine the US invasion of Cuba and the tensions over Germany, this meant that when Khrushchev and Kennedy met at their summit in the spring of 1961, this was an extraordinarily tense and difficult meeting, and Khrushchev gave Kennedy a very hard time. This was followed by the Berlin Wall going up in the summer of 1961. And of course, Khrushchev's decision, extraordinarily unwise, reckless, to put offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba. And Khrushchev was aiming not at war, he was aiming at showing the US a taste of its own medicine. The US had nuclear weapons in Turkey, near to the Soviet Union. The US had invaded Cuba. The US had not listened to Soviet concerns over a nuclear Germany. Khrushchev aimed to make a point. What a terrible way to do it. Because, of course, when the shipments of these missiles and their placement in Cuba was discovered by U-2 flights over Cuba in October 1962, they nearly led to full-scale nuclear war. A point that I think is extremely important to appreciate is that almost every advisor of President Kennedy in the early days of the Cuban Missile Crisis said to attack, said that only a military solution could work. There were very, very few advisors calling for a peaceful solution. One notable advisor was UN ambassador, or the US ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson. The history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, incidentally, has never been told better than by the great late historian Martin Sherwin in Sherwin's final book before his very sad death in 2021, a book called Gambling with Armageddon. And I recommend that everybody read it. It's startling and so relevant again, because we have a government that is gambling with Armageddon right now in the United States. Well, of course, we're here 60 years after the speech and nearly 61 years or 60 and a half years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy decided on a diplomatic approach, not a war, not a military attack on Cuba. And it was Kennedy's diplomatic approach and fundamentally a compromise where the US withdrew its missiles from Turkey and the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba, and the United States pledged never again to invade Cuba, that the Cuban Missile Crisis was brought to an end. Or I should say nearly so, because there's one more thing to know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then I'll get to the speech and its relevance for today. After Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed on unwinding the crisis, after a disabled Soviet submarine near the bottom of the Caribbean thought that it was being attacked by US Navy pilots dropping depth charges and live grenades, apparently, on the submarine. And the captain of the submarine ordered the firing of a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Under US military doctrine of that day, October 27th, 1962, had that nuclear-tipped torpedo been fired, it was the doctrine of the United States, championed by reckless generals such as Curtis LeMay, that the US would unleash a full unconstrained nuclear attack against the Soviet Union and all countries deemed by the United States to be in the Soviet camp, meaning Central and Eastern Europe and China. The estimates of the Pentagon were that such a full-scale attack would have killed 700 million people. That was the US plan. Of course, found out later from Carl Sagan and other scientists that it would have killed all of humanity by creating a nuclear winter. When the captain ordered the nuclear submarine torpedo to be fired, the order was countermanded by the commodore of the squadron, by the person who saved the world that you never heard of, Vasily Arkhipov, who said, "No, we will surface, we will not fire the submarine." This event for me illustrates, epitomizes our fate. We are subject to self-made annihilation by accident, by mistake, by insanity, by cruelty, by miscalculation, by calculation. And we don't understand it to this day, how dangerous and reckless our own actions are. So, the speech. In the aftermath of all of this, Kennedy, who came into office to be a peacemaker, embarked on one of the greatest acts of statesmanship in modern history. And the final year of Kennedy's life was a year of miracles. He led the peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He and Khrushchev wrote to each other, and Khrushchev was also a man of peace. They wrote to each other saying, "We must pull back from the brink. We cannot go on this way." And Kennedy embarked on a year of peacemaking that was a mix of vision, political genius, and statesmanship of the highest order. Because making peace at the height of the Cold War, in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, required a deftness and skill and bravery that is almost unimaginable. This speech that we just listened to on June 10, 1963, was part of that peace campaign. And what you heard, and what always gives me shivers listening to it, is that this speech is directed to Americans, not to the Soviet Union. It's not demands. It's not blustering. As Kennedy himself says, it's not racking up debating points. It is saying to the American people, we need to make peace, and we can make peace because our counterparts want peace too. They are human beings. They are not devoid of virtues. And Kennedy, of course, says that we should hail the Russian people for their achievements in science and in the arts and in space. He humanizes the other side, exactly the opposite of what we get every day from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, our so-called mainstream media, with their warmongers, their reckless reporters, their desire to humiliate the other side. Kennedy aimed to humanize the other side because he said they want peace like we do. And therefore, even our adversaries will abide by agreements in their interest, and peace is in their interest. When Nikita Khrushchev read the speech the next day, June 11, 1963, he immediately ordered that it be published in Pravda and Izvestia and carried over the radio and broadcast as widely as possible throughout the Soviet Union with no changes or edits. He called the US envoy, President Kennedy's envoy to Russia, Averell Harriman, and told Averell Harriman, I want to make peace with your president. This is the finest speech since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And within 5 weeks, the two parties signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. 5 weeks later. President Kennedy then took the peace campaign to the American people because the generals, the military-industrial complex, was either passively, aggressively opposed to this kind of peacemaking. President Kennedy went out to the West and gave speeches around the Western states. And even as the generals were casting doubt and skepticism on the treaty, the American people were rallied to the cause of peace. And when the vote in the US Senate came, it was 80-19 in favor of ratification. President Kennedy's last great speech to the world was to celebrate this achievement, this treaty, when President Kennedy spoke to world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in September 1963, just weeks before his assassination. And I used words from that wonderful speech as the title for my book 10 years ago, To Move the World, because President Kennedy said, and I paraphrase, when looking out from the podium of the UN to all the world leaders assembled in the General Assembly room of the UN, President Kennedy told them that Archimedes was said to have told his friends, give me a place where I can stand and I can move the world, explaining the principle of the lever. And then President Kennedy looked out to the world leaders and said, fellow citizens of the world, let us take our stand at this time and in this place to see if we can help move the world toward peace. And of course he did, and then was killed a few weeks later. Many people, including myself, believe that it was because of his peace initiative, probably rogue elements of the US government, perhaps the CIA and others. Of course, we don't know for sure. But in any event, President Kennedy had achieved the ultimate in global statesmanship and in peacemaking. And as the Beatitude says, blessed are the peacemakers. Well, what President Kennedy taught us about making peace in that speech is absolutely directly relevant for us today. First, he said, do not dehumanize or denigrate the other side. They are human beings. They want peace the same way we do. He said, communicate. And I keep hoping. President Biden, pick up the phone, send a Zoom link, talk to your counterpart. Talk to Vladimir Putin. Stop the sound bites. Stop the finger pointing, because those of us who know the whole history of this conflict, which goes back more than 30 years, knows how many times the United States has provoked this war. Pick up the phone and negotiate. And President Kennedy said words that are so relevant that I want to remind us of. And he used an important phrase in all of this speech. He said, above all, in other words, the most important message, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Above all, do not force a nuclear adversary into a choice between a humiliating defeat or the use of nuclear arms. It is so obvious to any experienced person in this, and I've watched this personally for more than 30 years close up, that there is no military route to Ukraine's security, because if we were to put Russia in the choice of a humiliating defeat or nuclear war, for example, the conquest by force over Crimea, rather than negotiating, we will do exactly what President Kennedy tells us would be a death wish for humanity. President Obama understood this in 2014. Even though President Obama unwisely, very unwisely, and Hillary Clinton very unwisely, and Victoria Nuland directly when she was Assistant Secretary of State, participated in the violent overthrow of the Ukraine president. President Obama knew, do not put this onto a path of war, because he said at the time, Russia has escalatory dominance, meaning that if we escalate, they will escalate. If we escalate, they will escalate. And because the issues facing Russia are perceived by Russia to be fundamental to Russia's national security, and that is the opposition to having a US-led military alliance expand to the 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, that Russia would escalate to nuclear arms if necessary. So Obama was smart not to start on that path. But ladies and gentlemen, we are on that path now, because President Biden, Victoria Nuland, who was promoted from her role in the overthrow of Yanukovych to being Undersecretary of State, Jake Sullivan, who was part of that story, who is now not the national security advisor to the vice president, but the national security advisor to the president of the United States, have been on the path of pushing NATO enlargement, irrespective of reckless risk, irrespective of Russian red lines. Even last week, the Washington Post ran a story which was shocking, but in our benumbed media environment, passed without notice. The story said Biden continues, in fact, more and more ignores Russia's red lines. And then a lot of reckless voices of the Washington military industrial establishment, the military industrial complex, were quoted as saying, yes, that's bluff, they keep going, rather than we get closer and closer to nuclear war. So this is where President Kennedy's speech is of fundamental and inestimable value to us today. For more than 30 years, the United States has pressed relentlessly an idea of expanding NATO in order to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. The whole idea was to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO so that there would be a ring surrounding Russia, including Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. This was spelled out already in the late 1990s, and apparently it was on the planning books, from what I'm told by historians, already in 1992. And now we are at war, and we are a deep threat, and we have not seen peacemaking. We haven't even seen communication. All we know about diplomacy is that at the end of 2021, when President Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement based on NATO non-enlargement, the United States said that is non-negotiable. It's none of your business where NATO goes. Then in March 2022, a few weeks after the Russian invasion, but mind you, 8 years after the real start of the war with the violent overthrow of Yanukovych, but a few weeks after the February 24th invasion, Russia and Ukraine were at the negotiating table, with Turkey being mediator. And they were close to an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. And the United States blocked it. So until today, the United States has done the opposite of never fear to negotiate. Thank you very much for bringing us together to heed the wisdom of President Kennedy. His wisdom can keep the world alive and safe, and we need to act on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.